It's the judicial decision the governor anticipated but feared, and the timing for his administration could scarcely be worse. What's the future of his Arkansas Works program without a work requirement? Public dollars for private schools. Will stiff opposition from the education establishment be enough to stop it? But first, assigning 45 agencies to 15 cabinet officers and the 2,000-page, 20-pound bill that would do it. Arkansas Week coming up.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Arkansas Week. We'll get to our roundtable and Medicaid and vouchers and some other issues in just a moment. But first, an issue that has been pending for months, and that is Governor Asa Hutchinson's ambitious program to reorganize, restructure the executive branch of government. And carrying that bill in the House of Representatives, Mr. Hutchinson's key ally on that, Representative Andy Davis, Republican of Little Rock. Mr. Davis, thanks very much for coming aboard.
Thanks for having me.
How soon? How close?
Pretty close. I hope to see the bill come out of Senate State Agencies Committee on Tuesday next week. It should be on their floor Wednesday or Thursday that week, and then back to the House to concur and send an amendment. So week after next, it should be finished.
By any measure, it is a mammoth piece of legislation. One of your colleagues described it to me on a table as looks like a wedding cake in white.
It's about this tall, printed single-sided.
In binders, though. Has the House had, has the General Assembly now a good working sense of exactly what it would do?
I think they do. If you're not aware, we began filing the bill in individual pieces back in December. So the bill, for the most part, has been in place for several months for the public and legislators to view and to read. And we filed that in 16 individual pieces. And I told them at the time, and it was reported in the press, one of the pieces was called General Provisions. And so if you studied that, then you really get the sense of what the overall change is. And then there's about 2,000 pages of name changes and technical corrections. So,
to the extent that there is or may be opposition to this, what are the reservations that you've heard thus far?
Most of the reservations we've heard go to the authority of a secretary. So the transformation plan is to reorganize all of the executive branch agencies into 15 departments, cabinet level departments, if you will, and each one of those will eventually have a secretary at the top. So today's directors that report directly to the governor will have a secretary between them and the governor. And most of, if there's any opposition, has been to the authority of those secretaries.
Well, some of us anyway, thinking back in 1971 with the last major restructuring of the executive, and that was under Governor Bumpers. And some of the reservations expressed then, I recall, were a loss of autonomy, and underlying that sort of a loss of oversight and to some extent a loss of patronage, influenced by the General Assembly over the executive branch or over these individual agencies. Are you hearing that?
Not all of that. There's, of course, were concerns initially over particularly cash funds, non-general revenue funds and revenue streams. All those remain the same. Nobody loses any funding today or in the future. Nobody loses any rule-making authority or policy-making authority is the way I couch that. This is strictly an administrative reorganization. So the secretaries are primarily going to have additional authority over employees, office space, HR concerns, strictly administrative things.
But the administration says this could save, as one estimate, I think is a common estimate, is could save as much as $15 million a year.
They've planned for $15 million of savings in the first year.
Realistic?
I think
government doesn't often shrink.
I think underestimated. I personally, based on visits we've had with consultants and so on and so forth over the last couple of years, I think the savings will prove to be much more than $15 million a year.
On to another issue, if I may. We are about an hour away, possibly. We're taping it mid-morning on Friday. The House is to convene. You and your colleagues will meet in about 45 minutes, and there will be, according to the Speaker, what could be a test vote anyway on the Medicaid appropriation. The first one following the judicial ruling striking down the Arkansas Works work requirement. What is your sense of your colleagues on this?
I think there will probably be a fair amount of debate, particularly the first time that we vote on it post the ruling. I won't be surprised if it doesn't pass the first time. Of course, I was present in 2013 when all of this began, then called the private option. So I hope it doesn't drag out as long as that did, but it may take a few tries to get it over the hump.
But you're confident that the appropriation will?
I think it will eventually
75.
pass. I think it will eventually pass. Members need to get a good grasp on the details. What does this ruling mean exactly? It doesn't mean that everyone that's been removed automatically goes back on. It just means we can't continue removing for the same purposes, that being the work requirements. It doesn't mean there's no change in appropriation. The appropriation has remained the same with or without work requirements. So I think when they get a grasp on some of the details, I think we'll get there.
And finally, an issue that is very close to your district, Pulaski, and that we have now two voucher programs. One that the administration's targeted at Pulaski, and a second piece of legislation that's essentially statewide. Where's this going?
I think that we'll see one or the other pass. I think the governor thought it a very reasonable proposal to do sort of a pilot study just in Pulaski County for a few reasons. You've got a population density, you've got private options. In many parts of Arkansas, particularly rural parts, there are no options other than public schools, so the voucher doesn't really do those kids much good. They don't have anywhere to go to. But I think he saw the Pulaski County option as a good proposal to start and to test the system. But it appears that there may be broad support in the legislature to make this a statewide initiative.
Well, in Pulaski anyway, your home county, you've also got horrendous, a myriad of problems, including some stiff opposition from educators statewide. Is this going to exacerbate a problem? Is it not?
I don't know that it would exacerbate a problem, and this is something that I think we often overlook when we're discussing schools, particularly in Pulaski County, is that there are kids in those schools today and tomorrow that can't wait on solutions that are resolved 4, 5, 6, 10 years from now. There are kids in failing schools today, so what is their option today? That's why we need the voucher program.
Are the schools themselves failing, or are the students failing for reasons that have nothing to do with a building or its faculty?
I don't know that we can answer those questions very definitively, Steve, but we've got to give the students all the opportunities we can, and that's what a program like is being proposed is. It's an opportunity, it's another choice, it's an option. Parents need those options to try to put their kid in the best place to succeed as determined by the parent.
All right. Representative Andy Davis, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for coming on. Hope you come back soon.
You bet.
And we'll be right back. The roundtable now, Benji Hardy with Arkansas Nonprofit News Network. Michael Hiblin, KUAR Public Radio, and Steve Bronner, an independent journalist. An adverse ruling, certainly adverse from the Hutchinson administration's point of view. That was the decision late Wednesday by a U.S. District Judge in Washington, D.C. that invalidated the work requirement of the Arkansas Works program, the aspect of the Medicaid expansion in Arkansas. On Thursday morning, Governor Hutchinson's reaction.
And whenever you lead on a particular issue, particularly nationally, you have to overcome some obstacles. And we received an obstacle yesterday in the court's decision. The judge's ruling made a couple of points that should be emphasized today. First of all, Judge Bosberg did not strike down the work requirement based upon the reporting elements that has created significant controversy here in Arkansas and media attention over the last 6 months. He did not strike it down based upon any of the reporting requirements. He did not reach that question because he had a fundamental disagreement with the work requirement in and of itself. His view is that Medicaid is an entitlement program and you cannot add additional requirements that may lead to a loss of coverage. That is his fundamental belief that goes through his previous opinion as well as this opinion. I contend that Judge Bosberg is wrong, and I'm urging the Department of Justice and Secretary Azar to appeal the ruling and to seek an expedited appeal of the district court's decision.
Benji Hardy.
Well, so not to split this too finely, but I think that the judge or others could take some issue with how the governor is framing this in terms of the judge's fundamental disagreement in this case. The judge didn't say in his opinion or in the opinion in an accompanying case in Kentucky, which is also trying to implement a work requirement in its Medicaid expansion program, that states cannot do a work requirement full stop. He basically said that the Trump administration didn't take into account, as it should have, the possible coverage losses in those states if you do implement that kind of a program. Now, as I think the governor is suggesting, like, you can look at the judge's ruling and think, like, well, there's no way that he's ever going to find that a waiver sufficiently took into account the coverage losses. So I think that's why it's likely that the Trump administration will appeal this to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And Arkansas, as an intervener in the case, doesn't have standing to appeal independently, but it's certainly going to be right there with the federal government fighting this. It appears. That is assuming that the state legislature does approve the state appropriation for the Medicaid budget moving forward.
Well, yeah, the legal arguments aside, the immediate objective for the administration, Hutchinson administration, is to get 75 votes in the House.
Right, and interestingly enough, I mean, part of the way that the governor framed this yesterday at his press conference was telling conservative legislators, essentially, look, if you don't move forward with funding the appropriation for Medicaid expansion, we can't fight for the work requirement, which everybody wants to see within this program. So he was sort of pitching them on this as like, this is our chance to be a leader in policy and in making health policy more conservative nationwide.
And a chance to save my budget.
Right.
While you're at it, Steve. As we should note again to the audience, as we did with Mr. Davis immediately preceding our roundtable here, at mid-morning on Friday, the House is to adjourn at 11 a.m. and Speaker Shepard, somewhat surprisingly, but perhaps not, indicated that he was going to move the schedule forward and have the first vote on Friday as opposed to next Tuesday on the Medicaid expansion. And as Mr. Davis indicated, there may more than one vote may be required. Steve?
Well, we've been here before. In fact, we've been here just about every year since 2013 with maybe one or two exceptions. The appropriation for the Division of Medical Services, which is what administers Arkansas Works. The opponents have tried to use that high threshold in order to kill Arkansas Works in the past. And moments before the judge made this ruling, this measure passed the Senate with no votes to spare, and now it heads to the House. And interesting that you said first vote. This is a chance for legislators to go on the record in that first vote and show that they're at least questioning it. We don't necessarily know the next steps, but ultimately it's always passed in the past, and the governor really wants it and needs it for his budget. So you would think that eventually, with 2 weeks left in the session, 2 or 3 weeks, it will eventually get through.
Yeah, Mike Hiblin.
Well, this was a concern for several senators who we knew this decision would be coming and said they wanted to wait until this decision actually came down. So now we are going to see the governor very adamant, though, and there, as you saw at the press conference with the head of the House and Senate alongside him, asking for lawmakers to maintain support for this, saying if we're going to challenge it, we need to go ahead and have this funded and be ready to go. But we're talking about 18,000 people who lost coverage last year for going 3 months without somehow meeting the requirements here for this work requirement. Democratic Party of Arkansas responded by saying, with this ruling, the state ought to implement, put back in coverage the people who did lose coverage. But we'll see what happens with this. Very interesting, though, to see the response and the number of people coming out to the governor's press conference on Thursday.
Yeah, and it's worth, Benji, I think, noting again that given the GOP majorities in both chambers, but right now the House, this is a problem for the Republican Party to work out. The Democrats are unanimous, of course, in favor of the program.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, you know, we're about to see with the House vote how big of a problem it is for the Republicans. And I think one other thing to note here is just like the immediate practical impact when it comes for beneficiaries in Arkansas. There's something like 235,000 people that are covered by Arkansas Works right now by the Medicaid expansion. Of those, there were, I believe, 116,000 that were subject to the work requirement. And something like between 5,000 and 6,000 in that range were potentially looking at being thrown off their insurance come April 1st in a few days. So with this judge's ruling now, that's all out the window. I mean, those folks are not going to lose insurance. And everybody that previously had to report those 80 hours of work activities per month no longer has to. The Department of Human Services said yesterday it was taking the web portal down effective immediately. And so the work requirement, at least for now, is no more.
All right, on to another issue, and that is school vouchers. We thought we had seen all of the administration's program major objectives many weeks ago, and then within the last several days, the governor pops in another one, and that's a voucher bill, Steve, devoted to or targeted at Pulaski County, but now there's two bills out there.
It kind of came out of nowhere. You know, at the very end of the session, the legislators agreed not to have they took away this year's filing deadline. So there was, in the past, there'd been a date certain when we would have no more bills, and then these kind of came through at this one that the governor referenced kind of came through really late. It would provide 500 scholarships to Pulaski County students, vouchers, in order to go to private schools and eventually even college. It's a 5-year pilot program, and then. This was a pretty it was a big deal, and the education establishment was prepared to really oppose it with both barrels. And then just the other day, the Senate sponsor basically put that one aside and came out and said he's going to actually push a different voucher bill that he had already introduced. That is more of a standard tax credit for if you donate to different organizations, and those can go to scholarships for students. It's another voucher program. Came out. This one was a big surprise too. People did not expect that to happen. So, in a session that seemingly had other big issues to consider, including Arkansas Works, now all of a sudden vouchers are a huge deal.
Michael Hiblin.
There was even confusion at the committee among members there of which one are we talking about? Obviously, Democrats are opposed to this. There was a press conference Monday, actually kind of dueling press conferences, but you had State Senator Joyce Elliott, former public school teacher, just come out, the typical discussion, but saying this would be further detrimental to schools that are already struggling in the state. But interesting, the different dynamics here of how you're framing this, because the other one was, I believe, for 500 poor kids within Pulaski County, and then to now have this tax credit instead. I'm not fully on top of it, quite honestly.
The ground shifts.
I'm not sure that anybody is fully on top of it because this has moved so quickly. And the legislation that just passed the Senate yesterday, the statewide sort of voucher-like tax credit proposal is not the one that people were expecting. So people are still sort of parsing the details of that. I think that one interesting issue there is the governor's response to all of this, because he initially made it very clear he was behind the Pulaski County bill, and he issued a statement to that effect when the statewide alternative bill came up, then it seemed like, well, is the governor supportive of this one or not? And he issued a statement after it passed committee saying, well, one or the other. I prefer the Pulaski one, but whichever one is fine with me, essentially. In the past, these programs have ran into opposition from the Statewide Superintendents Association, which is just very leery of sending any kind of public dollars to private schools or diverting potential state revenue in the form of tax credits to private schools.
Frankly, they hate it.
They do not care for it, right? Yeah. And all the Pulaski County superintendents were here at the Capitol to testify against it on Wednesday. I'm sure in House committee it's going to face an uphill battle there.
Okay.
One thing also, vouchers also split the Republican Party because there are a lot of rural legislators who don't have any private schools in their districts.
Right.
And so they typically are not big fans of vouchers either.
Yeah. We need to do a whole program on the fissures within the GOP in both chambers. But at any rate, on to another issue, and that's environmental. Steve.
Well, we had
talking about pig waste.
Here we are. Here we go again with the hog farms, C&H hog farms in Newton County. There was a bill by Senator Stubblefield that would attempt to move the permitting process from the Department of Environmental Quality to the Arkansas Natural Resources Commission. Senator Stubblefield said this was basically just to kind of streamline the process because it already goes through a two-step process to get certified for basically all liquid animal manure systems. It died in committee yesterday.
After about an hour and a half or so of discussion, had passed in the Senate, but you had opposition come out. You had Central Arkansas Water, you had Entergy, you also had the environmentalist Sierra Club, but after passing in the Senate, you had to be tabled for a further study, which essentially means it's out of consideration for this year.
Interesting because, the Farm Bureau, this was a Farm Bureau bill, and the Farm Bureau has always been a formidable political force at the Capitol, but you had this time a counterweight in public water systems and administrators from really across the state, including, interestingly, maybe even pivotally, Northwest Arkansas as well.
And you also had the governor come out against this too.
Yeah.
Because the EPA was getting involved, just a really questionable situation. So one of those things that it just kind of went, it got tabled and it's gone for the year.
Yeah, they don't want the federal government to assume ownership or oversight over this, and that's part of what had the governor leery.
And a couple of minutes left in the program. Only minutes ago, a proposal came out of committee with a do-pass recommendation, term limits. Steve.
We'll probably see that on our ballot in 2020. And basically, this is an amendment a proposal by the legislature for the voters to decide if the state's current term limits law would go to 12 years for House and Senate members, then a 4-year break, and then you can run again. And that would be different than the current 16 years. Really, a big motivation for this is to try to head off the pass a citizen-led initiative that would limit terms to only 10 years for life, stricter than even the current term limits law, stricter than Arkansas has ever had before. And so there's an effort to try to keep that to blunt that momentum. Now, that group, Arkansas Term Limits, is trying to get theirs on the ballot, probably will. So I don't know if it's going to succeed in blunting that momentum. The other thing that's kind of interesting is that they both have the same name, the Arkansas Term Limits Amendment.
Yeah.
So that should be interesting to see how that works out.
Opponents of term limits keep trying to drive a stake through this issue, and they can't. For 2.5 decades now, term limits, as it seems like with every session there's been.
Yeah, I think opponents were really upset by the developments in 2014 when there was the ballot initiative that rolled back term limits, and there's supposed to be a trade-off with a tightening up ethics rules, and it's widely perceived that it didn't, I guess, achieve all of its objectives. So, this is, and I think that voters, it's just they like the idea. It sounds good. So once it's on the ballot, it is a difficult thing to argue against for politicians.
All right, Jets. All right, Michael.
Johnny Cash, Daisy Bates statues heading to the governor.
and likely we'll get a signature. Thanks to everybody for coming in. As always, thanks to you for watching. See you next week. I still think that's so weird.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.